Thank you. What a powerful film, and we are so lucky to have the filmmaker Brian Maeda, as well as other important folks who are involved with the making of this film here today. We're going to have a quick panel and Q&A on the film. Just before we begin on that, I do want to let you know that we'll be putting a phone number up on the screen. If you have any questions for our panelists, we encourage you to text them to that phone number with your name, and we can share those with our moderator today. If you're unable to text them, you can also raise your hand and we'll have the moderator call on you as time permits. And so with that, I do want to pass it over to our moderator today. Emily Anderson is a scholar and historian and also one of our curators here at the Japanese American National Museum. And we are really lucky to have her expertise here today to guide us through this conversation. So with that, I want to introduce Dr. Emily Anderson.
Thank you. I've been in and out of JANM for 23 years, which betrays my age. But I have to say, one of my very first introductions to the story of Japanese American incarceration, of course, was Michi Wegland's Years of Infamy. And it was through that I first learned about not just the incarceration story in general, but of course about Tule Lake and all of the horrible things that happened there. So it's a nice reminder, but also it was very sort of revealing and incredibly educational, instructive, and moving to have that story come alive in this way. Before I introduce our panelists today, I also just wanted to point out that Tatsuo Inoue, who was featured prominently in the docudrama, who was in the stockade, but also was a judo instructor, a kamidana, or a portable Shinto shrine that was in his Tule Lake dojo, as well as the Tule Lake dojo original sign, are both featured in Sutra and Bible, which is on view across the way in our pavilion building. It's an exhibit that I am very much involved with. I co-curated that with Duncan Williams of USC. So since you're here, if you would like to see more about his life and the role religion played, as well as judo played for one of the key featured figures in this film, I encourage you, if you have time, to go take a look at that. But today, though, we're here to discuss We Said No No. First, I'd like to introduce Brian Tadashi Maeda, who was born in Manzanar, and since his time as a UCLA film student, has always wanted to show films from a Japanese American point of view. Brian was one of the first Asian Americans to be accepted in the Hollywood International Cinematographers Guild in the 1970s. Brian started J-Town Pictures in 1990. His films, Music Man of Manzanar, Buddha Heads, and We Said No No, have won critical acclaim at festivals and been played nationally. So Brian, I'd like to invite you to come join us up here. And next, Dr. Robert Lemelson is a professor of anthropology at UCLA. He is also an ethnographic documentary filmmaker. Craig Tsuyamine portrayed Mike Masaoka, secretary of the Japanese American Citizens League, but he also has an interesting connection because his family were no-nos. So even though he depicted a man who's often set up as sort of an oppositional to no-nos, he has a personal connection. So Craig, please come join us. And then Jennifer Mayer, who I believe is here, thank you, welcome, is the editor of the film and Brian's trusted associate on this journey. So welcome, Jennifer. And then finally, I believe Hiro Matsunaga is here. Is he? Okay, come on down. I feel like I'm doing Wheel of Fortune. Is the actor who plays Shigeru Matsuda, who was the leader of the Hoshidan and also Viola de Cristoforo's husband. So welcome. So we have about half an hour left today, and which I feel like is not enough time to ask all the questions we have. But what I'd like to do is I'm going to get us started out with a few general questions, and then I will open it up at the end, towards the end, to in-person audience as well as Zoom audience questions. I have a lot of questions. Some of the story I of course have known for a long time, but especially there's some especially regarding Rosalie Hankey's involvement. It was sort of more of an eye-opener, although Art Hansen, who was the featured historian, is a very, very dear friend of mine. So it was great to see Art on film. But before I get into some of the more substantive content questions, I would like to just ask Brian if he can share what inspired him to create this documentary focused specifically on this no-no, and within the no-nos, of course, because Tule Lake was such a complicated, and incredibly tense camp amongst all of the camps. But within the no-nos, you have the Sokuji, Sokoku Hoshidan, you had the the resegregation groups and those who were imprisoned under often brutal conditions in the stockade. But Brian, just starting out with the most basic question, what was your inspiration for this, and what made you decide to dedicate your filmmaking energy towards this documentary?
Well, this goes back many decades because I had read the book No No Boy, which is the first Asian American novel ever written. And it's a very, very powerful book. And at one point, some almost decades later after reading the book, I tried to get the rights to it, and it had always been wrapped up. But there was this little window where I can't remember his name. He was a Japanese-American TV director. He gave up the rights. And so I got the rights through this little window. And I wrote 3 drafts of a screenplay, and I came to the conclusion, I don't like this story. I don't like the book. I don't like the whining that goes on. As a Japanese-American, I can complain, and I do, ask my wife, but I don't like to see us portrayed going around whining. That's not my only personal take on the book. I know it's a very powerful book and it's a very important book. So I told his wife that, I tried to write a story and I just can't do it. So I gave that up. And, after some years of working on it. And then one day, as depicted in the film, my next door neighbor, Kendo Kirihiro, and I are having this conversation in the front yard, and he starts telling me about how he was in Tule Lake. I said, I know both our families were in Manzanar, but I didn't know that his family went to Tule Lake. And, it was after the colonel had come and asked him to volunteer. In all these 10 camps, the JACL had set up headquarters trying to get people to volunteer to fight for their country. And this really put off a lot of people, as you can imagine. So that kind of gave me the inspiration to visit this issue again, because it's a really powerful issue, and that it's come to fruition more in the last couple of years or so. So I started doing all this, finding all this. I found Rosalie's book on the internet, and I could not believe what I was reading. It was like a total drama. So that's what got me inspired in doing the No-No story again. And I found that these people like Violet, they were very, very committed, strong Japanese people who were going to fight for their rights, who were not ashamed to be where they are, and the position and the situation that they were put in. And that's very much the history of the Japanese people in America. But that's my story. I'm sticking with it.
Thank you. So I do also have questions for the actors because I think, these are, well, especially, it's, I have a lot of questions for the actors, but before we get to that, I am incredibly curious. So we have an anthropologist here. One of the things that has come out over the years is the role that academics, graduate students played and were hired. The U.S. government worked with specific professors and in hiring students to do direct field work in these camps. So, people were basically, being studied like guinea pigs for a variety of reasons. But also you have people like Rosalie Hankey, who clearly has a different understanding of her role than, for instance, Violet DeCristoforo did, who felt very much used and abused by her. So what I'd like to turn to our anthropologist. And so Dr. Lemelson, if you could perhaps, both speaking to Rosalie Hankey specifically, but also just to the role of fields like anthropology or sociology, both which I think are, directly implicated in this particular instance. What do you make of her role within this context, and also the accusations that Violet DeCristoforo has directed in her way over the years of complicity and in a way being an informant on a community that she had claimed to protect through anonymity?
It's a complicated issue for my field. Actually, since the beginnings of the field, the founder of American cultural anthropologist Franz Boas, after the First World War, it came to light that a number of anthropologists and archaeologists had worked for the war effort and been informants, and Boas stridently opposed that, publicly opposed that, and for that he was actually censured by the American Anthropological Association as unpatriotic. So it's kind of a parallel with the situation at Tule Lake. And then during World War II, the anthropology was quite a small field during that period, probably several hundred people, but 60 or 70% of them were involved in some way in the war effort during World War II. Margaret Mead, Gregory Bates, and Ruth Benedict, they all worked for the War Department in various capacities. And indeed, one of the great classics of mid-century anthropology is the Chrysanthemum and the Sword, which was a study of Japanese society at a distance. The fieldwork and the research was done in the United States, but it was she was commenting on Japanese society as a whole. And then in the 60s, there was Project Camelot, where anthropologists worked for the government in anti-insurgency campaigns in Central and South America, and to a lesser extent during the Vietnam War. Now, through this whole period, anthropology, I would not say stayed silent about this, but the association, the American Anthropological Association, still to this day does not have a formal position on collaborating with and with the government. Though I think in the field and with my colleagues, it would be something that would get you absolutely shunned by almost all your colleagues if you participated today in these sorts of activities. My interaction with Rosalie Wax, I actually read her book on fieldwork before I did my first piece of fieldwork with the Cambodian community in the early 1980s, and I found it just an absolutely fascinating and quite honest depiction. Now, that said, I've done 25 years of field work in Southeast Asia, and let's be honest, you don't get along with everyone, or you don't like or admire everyone you encounter in your field work, and that's just being human. And while she may have made some mistakes in how she represented the situation in Tule Lake, and certainly Violet clearly despised her and had some good reasons to despise her, I don't think that those sort of interactions are all that uncommon in anthropological field work. It's just to think that you're going to unrestrictedly admire and portray your participants or your subjects in an unequivocally positive way is it's a recipe for actually intellectual dishonesty. So yeah.
Actually, it occurs to me that, we might not, everybody here may be familiar with what anthropological field work is. And I think, it does serve as this very important through line through the whole film, that you have this person who who saw tension and disaster on the horizon and said, oh, I must be here because this will be such a great opportunity. Can you just sort of provide, I guess, sort of a sense of what one, certainly, and in this time, because anthropology has shifted so much as a field, but like in the 40s, what did it mean to be a person like her? What would she have been looking for? What was her goals? What kind of research was she looking to do? And since you're familiar with her work, like what insights did she gain from being embedded within Tule Lake?
Well, one thing that I found about her work, which is quite unusual for the anthropology of that period, in general, anthropologists anonymized everyone. It's the Balinese believe this or the Japanese believe this. There's no generally relative lack of representations of individuality in most anthropology of mid-20th century anthropology. That's obviously changed in the last 3 or 4 decades. Now, that said, her goal was, I think, towards the way that other anthropologists, it was towards promoting, U.S. national interests in understanding this population that the U.S. government had seen as potentially, traitors or forms of espionage. I don't think Rosalie Wax viewed them at all like that, but it's not to say that she didn't. And so her goals, I think her goals were the goals of ethnography, which is an honest and at times critical depiction of the communities in which you're working in. And I think that remains to this day. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you. Let me turn to the actors, because I do think, this is essentially a docudrama that takes together historical material, archival material, but also asks human beings to depict real life figures. Let me turn first to Hiro, because you were tasked with playing Shigeru Matsuda, who was a leader of the Hoshidan, who also, I only know of him through Violet de Cristoforo, who I know as a haiku poet. I've read her poetry, and so I know her as that first, and then I've read her biography, which just seemed very tragic. But here we get a view of Matsuda as well. As an actor, what was your experience? I mean, how did you prepare for this role, and what was your experience of sort of trying to take on this character who was such a very conflicted person, but tried to project so much strength in this very difficult situation?
Yeah, I wasn't really sure about this character at all. I mean, there was not much of a research that I could take from a very limited experience that I had, and a very limited time that I had to prepare for this role. But I just think that I just remember. I mean, I just think about the days in back in 1940s where the people suddenly just told that they have to evacuate everything and just go to this place. And then eventually he drove himself to go to become a Hoshidan and just to renounce his, I guess he was not a citizen, but, going back to Japan, because I'm from Japan as well, I've been here for 20 years, I can kind of relate to, being foreigner and like, pushed aside and your fortune, your how do you call this? Fate is decided based on politics. I mean, that's where I connected with him in that sense, and also the location that we had. I believe it was a base, U.S. base, and from the those days, right, 1940s. It's not used right now, so those place gave me the atmosphere, gave me more rooting myself into that location.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I always sort of describe myself as a kibe because I was born in Japan, but as a U.S. citizen. So I've always sort of my connection to it's. I don't have a direct family connection. My Japanese side is in Japan, but I've always felt similarly like I'm sort of not quite one or the other. So yeah, when I first discovered this had happened to Japanese Americans, I was a child. It was in the 80s in Japan, and there was a NHK drama series, and I thought like, well, crap, what's going to happen to my family, right? And you do you're so as just sort of a normal person going through the world without the power of decision making or deploying troops, like you're completely at the whim of these larger powers and authorities and all of us. Like, what would happen now, right? It's a very that anxiety, I think, and then once put in that place, what do you do? It's such a big I've always it gave me, I think it probably gave me nightmares when I was about 7 because it was very frightening to find out that this had happened, and what would happen today, I don't know. Well, let me turn to our other actor, if I may. I was sort of giving him a hard time before because I feel like, if you're given the task of portraying Mike Masaoka, it's always a complicated task. And but I felt like Mike Masaoka, or how I imagine him in my mind. But I think in your case, because your own personal background is sort of the opposite. I mean, I don't know, it's quite fair to anybody to set them up so directly, oppositionally. Although it is fair. What am I saying? So what, how was it being Mike Masaoka? Who's Mike Masaoka? Yeah, turn your mic on, Mike.
Thank you. I knew that. Mike Masaoka was kind of an interesting character because I thought he was kind of like the yin yang. Here he is, he's trying to do what he thinks is good, but at the same time, he has to deal with his constituents and all the people in the camp, and he's probably not going to come across as being the most likable fellow in the world. So it was a really interesting character to play just because there was a part of me that was, okay, I was trying to play him like, okay, he's trying to do some good for everyone in the camp, but at the same time, he's probably going to be the most hated man in the world. And it was really interesting. There's a little scene at the beginning. You didn't see it because of editing purposes, it was cut out. But when I was introduced to everybody in the camp, all the other actors and the background actors, they were all applauding. And it was like the weirdest feeling because I'm standing up there getting all this applause because everybody, all the other internees think, okay, here's the man. He's coming with some good news. He's going to straighten everything out. He's going to be our savior. And now here I am telling them like, go along with the internment camp. Everything's good. Don't worry about the fact that your property's been taken, your homes have been taken. Your life is pretty much over as you know it. Just go along with the flow. So when they were applauding me, because, that was part of the script, I stood there as the actor going, oh, man, it's like, and I was really conflicted at that point because I'm like, everyone is trusting me and I'm basically going to shoot everybody down right now. And it was a really interesting role. It's funny because when I was in high school, I was applying for a scholarship because I was a student athlete with the JACL. And I remember telling my mom, because both of my parents were in the camps, and I remember telling my mom, hey, Mom, I'm working on the scholarship being sponsored through the JACL. And she went, what? And I said, the JACL, And she goes, I hate them. And I'm going like, that's all she said. That's all she said. She walked away.
So is your mom the no-no side of your family, or who? Because you have no-no and relatives, right, or family members?
Well, actually, my dad was a no-no
Okay,
boy.
your dad was a no-no.
Yeah, he was up in Topaz.
That's right.
And then when he was declared a no-no boy, he was taken out of camp. He was sent down to Phoenix, and he was actually jailed. He spent the rest of his internment time in a jail.
Okay, I think now I understand. So he was a resistor, draft resistor?
No.
He was a no-no.
No, he was in the camp.
No, but no, draft resistors would have been in the camp too. I think I figured it out. Because if he was in prison, okay, so this is let me just take a second. Scholar's gonna step in here. And going back to the No Boy book, one of the biggest problems, and my understanding is that Tuttle named the book, it wasn't John Okada's choice. No Boy was the most misleading title for a book ever in all time. Because actually, John Okada's book is about a draft resistor. And the difference is that the no-nos answered no to the Loyalty Questionnaire, which was distributed prior to the draft. So you could be both a no and a draft resistor, but no-nos were those who answered no to the Loyalty Questionnaire, 27 and 28, and that got you mostly sent to Tule Lake, or almost entirely to Tule Lake. And from then on, if you renounced, you may be sent to Japan. The draft resistors were those who, when they instituted the drafting camp after the Loyalty Questionnaire and trying to recruit volunteers for the Army. So there was Loyalty Questionnaire, a call for volunteers, and then when that was pretty much a fail, I mean, not very many people volunteered out of camp. There were lots of volunteers out of the territory of Hawaii, but the camp volunteering was not very successful because, for good reason, people were like, what? We're in camp. You want us to go fight in the Army now? Like, what are you talking about? So then they instituted the draft. And when the draft was implemented, there are people who then said, no, I refuse to comply with the draft. And they were draft resistors. That's, I think, what your father was, because those people were put in prison, not Tule Lake, because they had broken the U.S. law for not going along with the draft. But because John Okada's book, No Boy, is called No Boy, not Draft Resistor Boy, those two categories tend to get confused by a lot of folks, and this is very common. But I think your dad, and I was always a troublemaker. I actually went on like a dress code strike in high school and got in trouble, but I was such a goody two-shoes student that when I got kicked out of class, I was like, what? But I can't miss class over this. But I will always admire both the no-nos and the draft resistors, but they're very much related, and there were actually a large group of draft resistors at Tule Lake. The one group that were acquitted for resisting the draft. Eric Muller's book is on this. It's a wonderful book that goes into more than the Heart Mountain draft resistors, who are the best known. However, this all makes sense. But JSAIL is definitely anti-draft resistor as well. So totally makes sense that this is how this happened. Okay, I'm going to. Let me turn to, I'm going to turn us to some, so those of you in the audience, there's a text phone number that you can text your questions to. We're doing this just to, we want to still be aware of somewhat not mingling too much. So if you can text your questions, and I'll go through those questions first and see if I can open things up. But I want to ask Jessica a question. What was your... sorry, I'm so sorry. Okay. Jennifer, I'm sorry. Can I ask you what your experience was like working on this film?
Well, it was really amazing because Brian really gave me the freedom to kind of explore and do a lot of research, and so it was just really an amazing experience, and I didn't know that much about it going in, so it was fascinating, really. I have the book right here if anybody Rosalie's book, I brought it if anybody wanted to read it. So I'd give it away.
So was this a history that you had been, that was familiar at all to you before you?
A little bit, but not, I didn't know anything about Tule Lake and the whole, that there were people rising up. I knew very little, I'll be honest. I didn't know much. I'm not, obviously, Japanese.
Oh, that's okay. You don't have to be to know about it. That's why we're here, to educate.
If I may just add,
Yeah.
I think that one of the great advantages in our relationship, is that she came with no baggage as far as the history of Tule Lake and the Japanese Americans like that, So it's like bringing this real fresh, open-eyed view. And, when they say that the film is made in the editing room, well, there's a lot of truth to that. You know, I presented her with a lot of material. And, you know, we actually physically, this is only the second time that I've seen Jennifer. You know, we met at the beginning of COVID.
Yep.
And it was like 9 months later, you know, we just were on the phone and texting and Zooming and all that.
Yep.
And one of the things that was really delighted me was there's throughout the film, you see a young Japanese girl that's dancing in a kimono, you know, and the first time I saw it, I said, what is this? You know, and then the more that I saw it, you know, I said, that's just really wonderful, you know, that addition of that aesthetic pause, and they were actually very meaningful in the section before it, you know, when you put them in there.
Well, and they are actually Tule Lake people.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think we talked about this.
Yeah, so that was a real good find. I did a lot of the, well, he didn't hire a researcher, so I researched and found out, and Densho was amazing, densho.org. Found a lot of great stuff.
Yeah, she found a lot of stuff, a lot of great stuff.
So I've got a question from the audience. This is for Brian. Please speak about the American history you were taught in high school. Did most Japanese Americans in your high school know about Manzanar and other camps? And what about with those friends who weren't Japanese American?
Well, the quick answer is I learned absolutely nothing. You know, and I got two of my high school buddies right here, Michael and Danny. They can testify to that when we were in school. No, there was the only thing that you learned in school was Pearl Harbor, and that was like the worst day of the year. You just want to crawl under the desk. No, you know, I can say that throughout, you know, even going into UCLA when I did, I can say that I was self-taught about the history of my people in this country. You know, none of this stuff was taught back then, you know, in the 60s, like that, you know.
Can I elaborate on that?
Yeah,
When
please
I
do.
was going to college in the 80s, it's kind of what Brian said. I recall in the textbooks, the only thing I ever saw was a half a page on Pearl Harbor with a picture of the battleship burning. And when I was in college, I actually talked to other students about the internment camps. And it was amazing. Okay, this was in 84. How many students I came across who had no idea that the Japanese were interned. I actually spoke with students who literally said to me, "Are you serious? Are you serious?" And I'm going like, yeah. In fact, I even came across a couple of the teachers who didn't even know about the internment camp experience. And I just thought, wow, this is a chapter of history that needs to get a little bit more exposure.
Yeah, I mean, that's why we're here, and that's why we share, you know, movies like this and our exhibits and other programs. So hopefully we're helping to get more people aware. You know, Hiro, you have probably a different perspective. Did you go to high school in Japan?
Yes, I did.
So what is your experience been sort of between what you learned in, you know, about history in Japanese high school and then coming here to the US and then, you know, getting probably more acquainted with Japanese Americans here in California?
I was very surprised about just, you know, the story I just heard from you guys about Pearl Harbor, half pages and then nothing else. You know, that we have half pages of Pearl Harbor in Japan. But we talk about Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and then all the other, you know, the war, how it led to the war, and how we finished the war, and all that stuff. So, a completely different story.
So I know that we're sort of coming to the very end of our time. So I think, you know, I want to, and again, back to Brian, since, you know, this is really the product of of a long process of wrestling with this topic. But so do you feel What do you feel now, with this Tule Lake, and the Tule Lake story to me is just such a tragic one, with the lack of just the administration sort of willful, hands-off approach to allowing just the festering of anger and frustration that led to the development of the Hoshidon and the push for renunciation. I mean, the U.S. government usually doesn't let you renounce your citizenship. It's very hard to, but here it was just rubber stamped. So now that we have this sort of on the screen, how does it make you feel to see these people and how they responded to their experience in Tule Lake? Seeing them, what do you feel towards them, these historical characters that you've brought to life?
Well, I think that I'm proud to see the characters that fought for their rights as Americans and as Nihonjin. Like I said, this is the legacy of the Japanese in America. And I think I portrayed heroic Japanese American characters. In casting this film, I was very specific in getting real Japanese, if you will, actors, because I felt that was the majority, if you will, of the members of the Hoshidan. Like Bill Nishimura said, the originators were Kibe, born here, educated in Imperial Japan, and then returned to America. And except for the Mike Masaoka character, who is an American Japanese.
Proud child of Salt Lake City. I can say I'm related to a lot of people in Utah, so sorry, that was an inside joke to myself. But
Well,
yeah,
okay,
who wasn't
I-
in camp because he was in Salt Lake City and then served in media for the Army. But sorry, I interrupted you.
Well, okay, we're sitting here in 2022, but at one time, Mike Masaoka was a very, very big hero in history because, at that time, of course, he was helping to work with the government because the government was going to do this with or without him anyways. But you have to respect the fact that his four brothers were all in the Army and they had fought for their country. If we didn't have this history of the 100th 442, we wouldn't have the respect of the people who know this story and this history. Japanese American history is completely fascinating. And Mike Masaoka's story is, here he is, his father had bought this piece of land, sight unseen, in Utah, and when he brought his family there, he couldn't make a farm out of it because of all this salt water. So he got duped, and he had to do handyman work, and his father died when he was 15 because he was drunk and ran his truck into a tree. So there was Mike being raised by Mormons, and he was a very, very brilliant student, especially in school. In debate school, he was one of the top debaters, and his friend of his parents' good friend wanted to send him to Harvard, and that they would pay because Masaoka was such a bright student. But his mother said that, no, I cannot accept an own like that. I cannot ever repay that, so I must refuse. And the first meeting that Masaoka had in Salt Lake City to the Japanese American people, he was talking about their rights as Americans, blah, blah, blah. And before he could finish, he was arrested by the FBI and taken off the podium. This was his first meeting with the government. So as that went on, he became, the spokesman for the JACL and helped with the evacuation, the eventuality of it, So read his book. It's called...
Read my book. Thank you. Thank you very much.
The title of the book is They Call Me Moses.
Well, and I think, so we need to wrap up, but, one thing I'd like to say, whether it's about, as you can, I don't really, hide my feelings about Mike Masaoka, but I think one thing that your film really highlights is that this was an impossible situation that people were placed in, whether it's Mike Masaoka doing his thing or, Hiro, the manager of the co-op who was murdered, who thought he was probably doing, whether it was out of self-interest or he really thought he was doing the best for his community. Every renunciant thought they were making the best choice that they had. Every soldier thought they were making the best choice in the moment. And I think that, and it is an enormous trauma for an entire community that persists today. These are tensions and divisions that have divided the community, divided families for decades. I've seen veterans. I saw a veteran yelling at Frank Emmy when I was when Frank Emmy was still with us. These are all the result. The divisions are the result of an incredible injustice done to a community. And I think this is a great reminder that your empathy towards Mike Masaoka is also a reminder that whether we see people as villains or heroes or somewhere in between, really what this comes down to is this incredible injustice and unconstitutional injustice done to a community merely for who their ancestors were and not for any other reason. And that has affected this community in this way. But at that moment, people did the best they could with what little, and very little was given them. Very few options were awarded them, but they did what they could with what they had in the moment. So I think, whether it is even with Mike Masaoka, but the renunciants, the Hoshidan, those in the stockade, some we may personally see more as heroes than others, but they all did the best they could. And I think our job is to really understand what happened to them that led them to that place. And also to return to them their humanity and their dignity in that process.
Yeah, and I also want to say that, for instance, when 9/11 happened, Norman Mineta, who was one of the great leaders of the museum here, was the Secretary of Transportation. And there was immediate talk about rounding up all the Muslims and putting into the camps. And Norman just grabbed the President Bush and said, no, you can't do that. You cannot do that again. And he told him what the story was on the Japanese internment. And we can look to today. What if we were to go to war with Korea, which is not that far out of the question, What would happen to this is the largest Korean American community outside of Korea, What would happen? Well, the first thing is the FBI has files on everyone in Koreatown, believe me, So it's something that we always have to be aware of, if you will.
So we have gone over time, so I'm going to have to wrap us up. And I'm sorry we couldn't take more questions, but again, I want to thank our panelists here today for our premiere of We Said No No. Thank you so much for sharing your time, your film, and for your incredible thoughts on this. So if you can all join me once thanking them.